Welcome to this chess video, everyone. Here we'll be continuing this free coaching playlist. Starts like this. E3 is not particularly common here, although it's completely playable. And then even less common is pawn to h6. Now you see these kind of moves a lot at the lower levels. These little dog-ear moves generally are to be avoided. The reason why is they do nothing to control the center, which this is just foundational chess. Those moves also do not develop the pieces off the back rank. Generally speaking, you'll want to develop your minor pieces first, get your queen off the back rank, and then get castled, usually kingside, and that will make your two rooks connected. Alright, now bishop d3 is solid, pawn c5, and the player who sent in this game here, they sent annotations along with it, and so here they commented this was a surprising novelty. Black strives for the center, and the pawn can't be won. We're only at move 3, so I don't know if I would really call this idea a novelty. You can actually check this really old video I made on the London system, where it actually shares this exact same c5 idea. But yes, it's a very natural move for black, it helps fight for the center, and white can't really capture this because at some point they'll advance the e-pawn, and they'll just win the pawn back. So here our player played pawn to b3, and they were more than happy to transpose into a KeSetoKaiba system. And so the fact that they're even familiar with that name tells me they're probably familiar with this as an opening repertoire for white. Alright, so the game continues like this. We have trades on d4. And despite the fact that black has played this move and kind of had a weird start, both sides are pretty well as far as opening principles are going. And I might have spoken too soon. This is a fine developing move, but we don't necessarily know if our queen is best located there. And so as black, they really should be developing their minor pieces first. I emphasize these two because generally speaking you want to get castled kingside, and these are the two pieces that are currently stopping you from getting castled kingside. Of course I'm kind of analyzing for the opponent here, but we're really doing this for both players to help illustrate the concepts. I would rather develop knight f3 before knight c3, because of the simple fact that white is going to want to get castled kingside. It is simply quicker. And those are the three opening principles to pay attention to. Control the center, develop pieces, and get castled quickly. These are guidelines, there's going to be exceptions to those. But generally speaking, you'll want to be castling kingside and just getting your king to safety. Now with the last comment being said, I don't really love knight c3. So here it was bishop to c3 that was played. And I think this is a completely fine move. Be a little bit careful about this bishop potentially being undefended as this knight moves. And maybe there's some tactical ideas, especially on the c-file. For that reason, you could even make an argument for wanting to block the c-pawn. This bishop is completely fine for now, even though it is temporarily inactive. You continue your piece development, and long term you can play for ideas like c4 and d5, and all of a sudden, this bishop has really good scope in the long diagonal. But okay, queen back to c7, we're already seeing potential discovered attack ideas on c3. Piece development continues, and now we have pawn to h3. Which I like this move, it just simply puts this question to the bishop, and then black chose to capture. Now in the comments that they wrote here, they said this is actually a good move for tripping up my pieces, and I have to waste at least 2 tempi to fix. I'm not exactly sure which tempi they're referring to, but I'm viewing this position very differently here. The way that I look at it is we have just now asked this bishop where is it going to go, and now they've chosen to voluntarily give up the bishop pair. We capture back, they only have one bishop, and we still have both of ours. Now, I'm not saying that bishop captures f3 was a bad move. In fact, bishop captures f3 and queen recapture, both the best move according to the engine. But the fact remains that you have to understand this bishop pair imbalance. If this is a little unfamiliar to you, you can check out this other YouTube video I made a while ago, because that's a game I'm definitely not going to forget the lessons of. Now this game continues, it's still about equal. Here a3 was played, and the comment they said was ghost of knight b4. Ironically, this is actually the best move in this position, according to the engine. Yeah, knight b4 is an idea, but I want to go back a bit before a3 and really talk about the motivations behind this move. In similar positions, if you're worried about ideas like knight b4 or any move that comes into your territory, then a3 is probably a mistake, because you're pushing a pawn, one of those dog-ear pawns we talked about, and it is not developing a piece and not helping you control the center. And if you're still in the opening, it also does nothing to help you get castled. So essentially that would be a waste of a move. Now, because this is a KeSetoKaiba setup, where we have this bishop here and the pawn back on c2, it makes sense in those variations to play pawn a3 at some point as kind of like a prophylaxis move to prevent something to coming to b4, specifically knight trying to win back the bishop pair. I say win back because here we already have the bishop pair, but in other positions black may have both bishops, and we want this to be a really good attacking piece when they castle kingside. So really a3 kind of depends on your motivations for why you're playing it. Here we have bishop d6, and they're referring to black playing for pawn e5. The game continues a little bit. We have the anticipated e5 coming up, and all of this actually looks pretty normal so far. Queen d1 just simply gets off of the e file. There's too many discovered attacks with the knight, and the game state is still pretty much equal. We have knight f3, which is a good move. I really like that. It's just improving our pieces, helping fight for the center. And now knight to d4 blockades the isolated pawn with the knight. We don't really get our first inaccuracy until a few moves later. And so here's where I'll pause the game. Now the last several moves I kind of sped past, but it is important to note that white's pawns in front of their king are advancing kind of far. In this case, it makes a lot of sense because we were trapping this bishop. Of course, if you're threatening to win material, that's a really good reason to advance and take a little bit of risk. But if it wasn't for that material gain, generally speaking, advancing those pawns in front of your castled king is a very risky idea that you should usually avoid. Now here, this subtle inaccuracy was bishop to d3, which is really one of the most normal moves in the world. So I don't fault them for playing that, but I do want to go back and just highlight there's actually something here that's really intriguing. You can play knight captures and then rook to f3. Now, although this is much more advanced and this bishop is hanging, I mention this because the ideas I'm about to share here become relevant much later in the game. Okay, so what exactly did my line accomplish? Well, first of all, we had a really good knight on d4 that appeared to be blockading this pawn, and that was an isolated pawn which we've now fixed because now these pawns are connected. So it sure looks like we're helping the opponent. I suspect that maybe that was seen and why this line wasn't played. Or maybe they just saw the bishop and wanted to move it back. But there's a few other subtle little details here that really are worth mentioning. First of all, remember we had problems on the c-file, especially when a bishop was on c3, but also with something potentially against c2. Well, that was problematic because that was a half-open file. Now we do not have that because we've actually blocked off the c-file. By having them recapture with the pawn, which is actually their best move to fix the weakness, that's indirectly actually covering our weaknesses. The other element here is rook to f3, which will help cover g3, the pawn base right in front of our king. And that's really important because of how much these pawns have advanced. Now g3 comes under fire a little bit later. They probably would love to have a rook on f3 in those variations. And the very last thing I have to address, of course, why don't they just take this bishop? Well, we have to keep in mind this bishop is also hanging, and we do have a rook on the f-file, so this knight would be under a lot of attack considering the bishop also on this long diagonal. So opening things up on the file we have a lot of pressure, really not such a bad idea. But okay, let's return to the real game now. Knight h5 was played, and now there was the tactical trick knight to f5, couldn't take because that would drop this knight, but instead we have this, and I'm still completely fine with this. It closes up the c-file, and actually white is doing alright here. The only reason that black is really a little bit better is because of their pressure on the open file and the ideas they have against g3. That being said, it is no surprise the top engine move here is rook f3. It helps cover against a rook infiltrating on e3, and it also defends the g3 pawn. Now in the real game it was queen to g4 trying to defend this pawn, maybe get another piece towards the black king, but this is where rook e3 comes in, and why the rook here on f3 would have been a little bit better. The reason the engine calls this brilliant is because it can't really capture this bishop on account of this rook capture, and now the queen is forked with the king, and there's really a lot of attacking pressure against white. Okay, now we find the rook to f3, and black thought they were trapping white's queen by pawn to f5. Really strong would have been queen b6 and now setting up discovered attacks when this rook moves. But unfortunately for us, black found that on the very next move. What they played here was bishop captures f5. If this recapture, then the white queen escapes. And so now they had queen b6, and now king to h1. I don't know what time control this game was, but assuming this isn't a speed chess game, I really wonder why this move in particular was played. Yes, it does kind of tuck your king away in the corner, but with these pawns advanced, there really isn't that much shelter, and it walks into potential checks if this knight ever attacks g3. King g2 is really the way to step out of the line of this discovered check, because now it has some shelter behind those pawns. If they give this check, now we can come back to h1, it could go something like this, and somehow white is barely holding. Okay, but this is where the game gets really crazy. We have rook to e1 check. Now it's important to note that if they had instead gone rook captures f3, black is actually winning on account of this, and then rook e3, and there's a lot of pressure against g3. Now after this move, this spectacular defense was found, rook to f1, queen f2 trying to utilize the back rank pin, and then throwing in the only drawing move, bishop to e6 check. The king moving to h7 would have been in equal position, which would look like this. And somehow, this position is equal. There's just too many checks for both sides, and it's a really surprising the way that the dust could have settled. What we end up having is this rook capture, queen captures, noticing if this ever moves off this rank, then we have this capture of the queen. And so instead they move their king, but now we have queen to e8 check. Now they take, and we have this capture. White is up by 3, and the pins were really utilized to their advantage. White is still up material, king here is fine, and now they set up a discovered attack against the rook. But now this is where things begin to slip a little bit. Their honest comments here mention that they thought the knight would blockade from knight e4, and there's not really a way into black's camp. They thought that this was really a draw. They mentioned not really seeing the pawn c4 pawn break to open up the position. And okay, fine, perhaps you don't see those things, but even without that, what about pawn to f5? If this knight is over here, that also opens up the position. And if there's no tactical tricks, what about maybe just doubling rooks? There's a lot of ways that white can make progress here. You just have to be a little bit careful against this, but other than that, white is definitely in control. At the very least, they are up material. Even if you were to give back the exchange here, material will be equal and you still may be winning. Okay, so we have bishop to d4. This knight playing this discovered attack on the rook. And now we have this check, a king move, and then trying to save the rook. This is a completely fine move. You just do have to be aware that this is a loose piece, and there may be potential ideas against it. But as long as you're aware of those threats, then you're completely fine with that rook move. Another idea is leaving the rook here, and instead of playing this check, you could actually have grabbed this pawn. After you take here, you can give back the rook, recapture back, and you are up a smidge amount of material, but black really doesn't have the firepower they had against white's king from before. That's a much more advanced way to try and simplify, because most people are not willing to give back material. But just throwing it out there, that was a possible option. Alright, the game continues. We bring the king up, and I won't really comment on this too much, because here that allows bishop to e1, and that idea comes up a little bit in this game, but was missed each time. The idea is that it's really misplacing this rook. It really doesn't have too many places to go, and black has annoying, perhaps even equalizing pressure. Okay, without that move being found, white is still in control, so they defend this rook. I like this position a lot for white, doing really good here. And now defending the pawn is very natural. It would get a little bit tricky after knight f5, kind of like what we had in the game. So one really interesting idea was to just sacrifice the pawn. If king here and this check, we can try and scurry our king away to the queen side where we'll be a little bit more protected behind our rooks. And the idea of c4 was we are trying to blast the position open. If our king is on c2, our rook will come into the game. We'll have a really nice open file where we have doubled rooks. And white definitely has entry points and weaknesses they can work with. For example, having the rooks target the a6 pawn. Okay, knight f5 was played in the game. We have this move, which unfortunately gives back all of the advantage. Bishop to c5 was slightly better. So here we have this kind of position. This check, king move, this check, king move, this again. And the position continued to repeat. And here we have a draw by threefold repetition. Now to be fair, the position was equal going into this, so a draw is a pretty fair result, and the comments did mention that they were okay with the draw here. I don't know what the player ratings were, maybe their opponent was higher rated and they would get some rating. But whatever the case, if we go back before the repetition happened, white did have a few chances where they could have kept pressing for the win. Before the king f3 move was played, maybe a one option would have been trying to trade off the bishops. Remember, white is up material and more than happy to trade going into an endgame where they are slightly ahead. Another reason this move is appealing is because white's king is much more under attack than black's here. And so generally, if you can trade off the potential attackers against that king, the attack begins to fizzle away and it becomes a lot easier to help convert your endgame. If they trade, then recapturing is easy. But if they retreat back instead, we can start fighting for the open file. And now we're offering a trade of rooks. I thought a draw here was a fair result, although kind of surprising. Late middle game to early end game. But hopefully this was an instructional example that everyone here can learn from. Thanks for stopping by, everyone. I'll see you in the next chess video.